for a second. You wake up, you roll over, check your phone, and you realize that history,
Like actual history.
yeah, I mean, map-changing, textbook rewriting history, it all happened while you were asleep.
Yeah.
Not a rumor, not some vague diplomatic gesture, but a real fundamental shift. And, well, that's exactly what happened just a month ago.
It was a massive moment, really. December 26, 2025. That date is, it's going to be circled in red on calendars in the Horn of Africa for a very long time.
The news breaks that the State of Israel has become the very first UN member to formally recognize the Republic of Somaliland as a sovereign, independent nation.
Hmm.
Now, I know for some people listening that might just sound like another headline in a busy news cycle, but if you've been following this region even a little, you know that calling this a diplomatic breakthrough is like the understatement of the century.
Oh, it's a seismic shift. And
Yeah.
you really get the weight of that. You have to realize Somaliland isn't some new project that just, popped up last week.
Right.
They haven't just been waiting around for permission to exist. They've been operating with their own constitution, their own democratically elected government, their own currency, police force, passports for over 3 decades.
30 years. That's longer than a lot of recognized countries have managed to maintain stable governments. So naturally, in Hargeisa, that's the capital of Somaliland, this news was huge.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking street parties, fireworks, just these shock waves of celebration. It was basically the validation of an entire generation's work.
Precisely. A moment of vindication.
Mhm.
But, and this is really where we get to the core of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
If you weren't in Hargeisa, if you were watching the news elsewhere, specifically on certain major international networks, you might have gotten a completely different vibe.
A very different vibe.
You wouldn't have seen a celebration of sovereignty. You would have seen a crisis.
And that disconnect is exactly what we're unpacking today. We aren't just looking at the politics of the deal itself, we're looking at the machinery of how that news was delivered to the world. And we've got a fascinating document in our stack. An analysis report titled Al Jazeera's Coverage of Somaliland, an anti-recognition narrative.
It's a really gripping piece of media analysis. It treats the news coverage almost like a crime scene, breaking down the specific mechanisms, the language choices, the sourcing bias, what they left out. All the things that were used to construct a very specific narrative.
I love this kind of stuff. It's like a forensic audit of the nightly news. The claim here is that one of the world's biggest media outlets didn't just report the news. They actively framed it to delegitimize a nation.
It's a classic case study in media literacy.
Yeah.
It shows how you can report facts, technically accurate facts, but still shape the truth to fit a worldview. And it starts, as these things so often do, with the vocabulary.
Right. Let's get into the weeds on this. The first thing the source analyzes is the labels. Words have power, right? And the report highlights a couple of specific terms that just kept popping up in headlines after December 26th.
They certainly do. The analysis points out the repeated, almost obsessive use of terms like self-declared state and breakaway region.
Okay.
Now, let's pause there. To someone just tuning in, those might sound like neutral factual descriptors. You might think, well, they did declare themselves a state, so it's accurate.
Self-declared. It sounds like something I'd say if I walked into a room and announced I was the emperor of the podcast. It feels unsubstantiated, like it's a hobby, not a reality.
That is exactly the psychological priming the report is arguing about here. When you label a state self-declared in every single headline, you're implicitly signaling a lack of validity. It suggests their status only exists in their own heads, despite the physical reality of their government. It's a subtle way of saying they think they're a country, but the adults in the room disagree.
And then there's the other one, breakaway region. That one feels even more loaded to me. Breakaway sounds temporary. It sounds kinetic, like a rebellious teenager running away from home who's going to have to come back when they run out of money.
Precisely. Breakaway implies a temporary rebellion, a crisis in progress, not a permanent political status. It frames the existence of Somaliland as a subtraction from Somalia, rather than an entity in its own right.
I see.
The source argues that by sticking to this vocabulary, 30 years after the fact, the coverage aligns itself perfectly with the narrative of the Somali federal government in Mogadishu.
Because their whole position is that Somaliland is just a wayward province that needs to come back to the fold.
Correct. So by exclusively using those words, the reporting isn't neutral. It's effectively taking a side in a 30-year-old dispute. And the report contrasts those labels with the facts on the ground. 3 decades of effective self-governance.
It's a really interesting distinction. It's like the difference between calling someone unemployed versus freelance. One frames it as a failure, a lack. The other frames it as an independent choice.
That's a great analogy. If you have a police force that arrests criminals, a parliament that passes laws, a currency you use to buy bread, and you've done that for 30 years, calling you a breakaway region starts to feel less like a description and more like a political stance.
Yeah, it denies the reality on the ground.
It denies the de facto reality, yes, in favor of a de jure fiction that the union still exists.
Okay, so the labels set the stage. The audience is already primed to view this place as illegitimate. But then the event itself happens, December 26th. Israel recognizes Somaliland, first UN member. Boom. How do you possibly frame that negatively?
Well, this is where the framing concept really comes into play. The source notes the coverage had a choice. They could have focused on Somaliland's agency,
Right.
a nation achieving a major diplomatic goal it has worked toward for a generation. A success story.
Yeah, the headline could have been Somaliland's historic triumph or new chapter for Somaliland. But looking at this report, that is definitely not the angle they took.
No. The coverage pivoted immediately to controversy. The headlines were just dominated by words like condemnation, regional unease, and anger.
It shifts the protagonist, doesn't it? The story becomes about how angry everyone else is, rather than what Somaliland actually achieved.
It creates a specific lens for the viewer. The report details how the coverage highlighted claims from Somali authorities that this recognition was a violation of territorial integrity. But it went further than just quoting angry officials.
How so?
The source notes that the reporting actively raised fears about military bases or even forced resettlement linked to the agreement.
Wait, forced resettlement, that sounds incredibly ominous. That's the kind of language that triggers immediate alarm bells. Where did that even come from?
It appeared in the initial waves of reporting. And here is the crucial counterpoint the source highlights. The Somaliland government officially denied these claims. They went on record saying, no, that's not what this agreement is about. There is no forced resettlement.
But that got buried.
But the analysis shows the reporting prioritized the fear and the rumors over the denial.
So the narrative becomes about the danger of the event, not the substance of it. It just creates a sense of panic.
Precisely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source argues this creates a destabilization narrative. By focusing entirely on the angry reactions of neighbors, rather than the sovereign decision of the two principals, Israel and Somaliland,
Yeah.
the coverage paints the recognition as illegitimate, provocative, or destabilizing.
It's like if two people got married and the newspaper report on the wedding only interviewed the jealous ex-boyfriend who was screaming outside the church.
That is actually a surprisingly accurate analogy.
You completely miss the love story because you're just focused on the shouting match.
You shift the agency away from the people making the history, and you hand the microphone to the people trying to stop it.
Yeah.
And that leads us perfectly into the next big point from the source, the echo chamber. Who actually gets to speak in these stories?
This is something I always try to look for now. Sourcing bias. It's often where the bias is most visible, but it's also the hardest to spot if you aren't really paying attention. You have to ask, who is holding the mic?
Exactly. The source identifies a distinct pattern of sourcing bias. They looked at who was quoted and whose opinions were given prominent space, what we call the A block of the story, the first few paragraphs that set the tone.
And let me guess, it wasn't the people popping champagne in Hargeisa.
Not primarily, no. The source indicates that quotes from Somali officials in Mogadishu and various Arab countries condemning the move were given the spotlight.
Okay, but playing devil's advocate here, surely those voices are newsworthy. I mean, if neighbors are angry, if big regional players are issuing statements, that is news. You can't just ignore it.
Absolutely, and the source acknowledges that. Conflict is news. But it's about the balance, the weight.
Right.
The argument here is that these critical voices were prioritized to such a degree that they just drowned out Somaliland's own framing of the event. The report calls it an implicit alignment.
Implicit alignment. That sounds like a fancy way of saying the network is just repeating what its friends are saying.
In a way, yes. The source points out that countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia swiftly rejected the recognition. Now, we have to consider the geopolitical context here.
Sure.
The analysis suggests that the coverage just mirrored these regional diplomatic stances without critically examining them.
So instead of acting as a neutral arbiter that says, okay, Somaliland says X, neighbors say Y, it becomes more of an amplifier for one side.
It creates an impression that the network echoes these anti-recognition voices.
Yeah.
If you're a viewer, And you see quote after quote from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Somalia, all saying, this is illegal, this is bad.
Mm.
And you see very little from Somaliland explaining why they did it. The sheer volume of negativity is what shapes your opinion.
It creates a consensus of condemnation. If the only voices you amplify are the ones shouting no, the audience is led to believe that no is the only reasonable position. It makes the recognition feel like a rogue act.
Exactly. It delegitimizes the act by isolating it. And this is so powerful because most listeners don't have the background knowledge to push back. They rely on the outlet to provide that context. If the outlet says everyone is angry, the viewer just assumes the anger is justified.
Which brings us to the other side of the coin. We've talked about what they did say, the labels, the angry quotes. But often, the most effective way to shape a narrative is through what you don't say.
The sins of omission. And this is often the most damning part of the analysis in the report. The source argues that there was this significant lack of sustained focus on Somaliland's democratic credentials.
Which is strange, because if you're talking about a country seeking recognition, the first question a listener usually has is, well, what kind of country is it? Are they the good guys? Does it function?
Right. And the source lists specific factors that were just underreported or completely ignored. I mean, Somaliland has a record of relative stability that's incredibly rare in the Horn of Africa. They've held multiple competitive presidential elections, peaceful transfers of power. They have functioning institutions, a biometric voter registration system.
Biometric voter registration. That's more advanced than some places in the U.S.
It is. And in a region so often characterized by turmoil and warlordism, Somaliland is frequently cited by independent observers as a success story, a beacon of democracy.
But that doesn't really fit the breakaway region narrative, does it?
It complicates it immensely. If you report on their stability, their democracy, their 30-year track record, that self-declared label starts to look silly. It forces the audience to ask, wait a second, if they're doing everything right and they function better than the country they supposedly belong to, why shouldn't they be recognized?
So if you're trying to maintain the anti-recognition narrative, you just can't talk about the stability. You have to ignore the success.
Exactly. Instead of highlighting the stability, the reporting tended to highlight disorder or conflict in the wider Horn of Africa. It blurs the lines. The source argues that ignoring the stability of Somaliland reinforces the idea that its statehood is a problem to be managed rather than a success story to be celebrated.
That is such a key distinction, a problem to be managed. It turns the existence of the country into a headache for the world. Oh, look at this troublemaking region causing issues for its neighbors, versus look at this resilient people who built democracy from the ashes.
And that brings us right back to the core thesis of the source material. It calls this a narrative of doubt. The coverage wasn't just reporting on a dispute, it was framing independence itself in a negative or skeptical light.
It's really a masterclass in how media works. It's not about lying. They didn't necessarily make up fake quotes, but by choosing which words to use, self-declared, which angle to lead with, fear and anger, and what context to leave out, democracy and stability, they built a completely different reality.
And it matters because it's a lesson in how reality is mediated. The source concludes that this pattern suggests the reporting was anti-recognition rather than neutral. And for the learner, listening to this, for you, this is crucial.
Right, why should you care? Maybe you don't have a stake in the Horn of Africa, but this happens everywhere, doesn't it?
It does. It's a reminder that neutral reporting isn't always neutral. Just because a news anchor isn't shouting their opinion doesn't mean they aren't shaping the story. The editorial choices, who gets the mic, what adjectives are used, what history is included or excluded, those are all subjective decisions.
It forces us to be much more active consumers of news. You have to ask, why did they choose that word? Who isn't being quoted here? What is the context they're leaving out?
Precisely. If you consistently use language that diminishes a subject and consistently source people who oppose that subject, you have taken a side. And in this case, the side taken was against the reshaping of the map.
It's a powerful takeaway. We rely on these outlets to tell us what the world looks like. We assume the map on the screen matches the reality on the ground. But in this case, the map on the screen was actively fighting against the reality on the ground.
It raises a really provocative question, one that I think you should sit with. It's a bit philosophical, but it hits hard.
Lay it on us.
If a nation have a constitution, a currency, maintains law and order, and holds elections for 30 years, but the international media only calls it a breakaway region defined by its neighbors' anger, does the media coverage actually have the power to overrule reality?
That's this.
Yeah.
At what point does the map on the screen become more real to the world than the actual lives of the people living there?
It's the battle between the narrative and the facts. And in this case, the narrative was putting up a serious fight to keep the map from changing.
It forces us to ask, who is drawing the map? The people living on the land or the people in the newsroom?
Indeed. And as we see with this recognition by Israel, sometimes the reality on the ground finally breaks through that narrative containment. But it took 30 years.
Deep stuff. As always, don't just take our word for it. We've got the full source analysis on the incident and the coverage available for you to check out in the show notes. It's a fascinating read on the December 2025 recognition event and just a great tool for sharpening your own media literacy skills.
Definitely worth a read. It will change how you look at the headlines tomorrow morning, regardless of the topic.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll catch you on the next one.
Stay curious.